So for regional approaches, I've divided up my remarks into 4 different sections. I'm going to talk about how you build coalitions and some different models for building coalitions. I'm going to talk about where you can develop funding. And this is not a menu. This is not, you're going to pick the 3rd option on the 2nd slide and go for it. These are just examples of how other communities have done it that hopefully will spark some ideas and hopefully motivate you to understand it is accomplishable. I'm going to talk about how you can still partner with the Army Corps of Engineers and there is still a role for federal construction. And then talk about advancing projects, and that's how you can get ahead of the Corps on some issues and still partner with the Corps on other issues. So here are some different models for how coalitions might be built. And in California, we have something called the Joint Powers Agency, and it's basically an interlocal agreement, much like Metro is up here. And it is an ability under state law in California whereby different local agencies or state agencies or nonprofits or mutual water companies, which are a unique private partner entity, kind of like your improvement companies, can come together and they can either agree through an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that they'll operate together, or they can agree to actually form a new 3rd entity, or 4th entity or 5th, depending upon how many there are that are members, and then they operate under it. And in California, we found it to be a very effective model for actually figuring out how to move things ahead. And you're going to see that that new agency model is actually the first 2 bullet points, and arguably it could be the 3rd bullet point as well, whereas 4th and 5th are slightly different models. So I'll talk about each of these in a little bit of detail and also give you a sense of where these models have actually been used. So new agency created by interlocal agreement is a model that's used for about 4 different entities in the Sacramento Valley, the Sacramento Central Valley. And in different cases, the numbers of entities that come together to create the new entity vary. For the West Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, it's the City of West Sacramento and 2 reclamation districts, which are like your drainage districts. For the Three Rivers Levee Improvement Authority, it is a reclamation district and a county that came together. For the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, it is a city, 2 counties, and 2 reclamation districts. You can see that there's a pattern developing. It's who are the local people who care and who have some interest in moving things forward. And so in the Sacramento Central Valley, where people have found advantages to these models, is it allows a local district, like a drainage district, to bring in a little bit of heft from a larger entity, to potentially tie into some different funding sources, to tie into some different supporters, to tie into different expertise. The advantage from an entity like a city or a county is it allows it to create an entity which doesn't have to compete for resources. And I don't just mean compete for dollars, I mean compete for attention. It is very challenging when you have a city that often by itself says, I'm going to go out and I'm going to solve the flood problem, or sometimes counties have those issues, because there are city council meetings or there are county, is it supervisors in Oregon? What? Commissioners, thank you. So you have county commissioner meetings, and if you look at those agendas, there's everything under the sun, from the award to the local Boy Scout who sold the most money, to the improvement project to fix the drainage under the road, to the money that the sheriff is going to get, to the whatever. And it's sometimes hard to get traction on these issues with so much else going on. So by creating these separate entities that are really multi-purpose, but the purpose is all identified relating to flood. They might be looking at habitat issues, they might be looking at recreation issues, but it all comes back to these projects. And that singular focus often allows them to succeed. So that's the first model. Now the second model is almost identical to the first, but it often addresses concerns by people that were creating additional layers of government. And we don't want additional layers of government. We have too much government, so how do we avoid that? Well, it's the same model, but instead of hiring staff, the entity contracts with one of the members and says to the members, you use your existing staff to staff this. So for example, I'm not terribly familiar with all of the local issues, but if one of the local districts wanted to partner with a city and the district had the capability of actually running a project, the joint entity could contract back to the district and say, we want you to run this from a staffing perspective. So that's really the difference between 1 and 2. Number 3 is a model where instead of forming it locally, you go to the legislature and you say to the legislature, could you create our new entity? And that new entity might have governance that's modeled like an interlocal agreement. It might have governance that's modeled differently. Usually where that's done, it's because there's some additional authority that you can't get by forming a local entity and you're looking for the state to provide it. So in the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency is this 3rd bullet point. And it did this because it wanted a taxing power that it couldn't have had if it had done an interlocal agreement. Went to the legislature, convinced the legislature this was a good thing, formed the entity, and it runs just like an interlocal, but it has additional authority. So that's the 3rd model. The 4th model of a repurposed local agency is an example actually from East St. Louis. And in Illinois, the Illinois side of the river, east of St. Louis, there's a series of communities there, and they discovered they had significant problems, and they needed an entity, and someone did the old, let's go look through the statutes that were passed 150 years ago and see what's there, and they found an entity that had been defunct for 75 years, but it had boundaries that roughly covered what they needed, and they simply got the legislature to repurpose it. They gave it a little bit more authority, and it was able to go off and do what they needed to do. And so that's another model that I've seen. And then finally, the existing land use agency just taking over. And the city of Dallas is an example for that. City of Dallas wanted to run a local project. They're partnering with the Corps in a study, but they also wanted to get some stuff done locally. And they looked at the different models and said, we're a sophisticated city. We've got a great public resources section, a great public works section. We can just have that entity run with this. And so the city of Dallas actually stepped in. So those are some different models that I've seen around the country, all effectively used. Then you get to the issue of developing funding. This is probably the scariest one, especially when people throw out numbers like $1 billion. And I can tell you that I have not worked on any project where when it started, it was obvious how we would fund it to completion. It's just too big of a bite. There's the old joke about how do you eat an elephant, and the answer is 1 bite at a time. If you tried to eat this whole elephant from the very beginning, you almost certainly would not succeed. And so thinking about how projects evolve, how you do some studies, how you gather some information, and then you fund some design, and then you know the project well enough to actually consider construction, and tying funding to achieve that has really been a very successful model for the projects that I'm familiar with. These projects also tend to take long periods of time, and the economy comes and goes during those times. And at some times, the economy might be great, and you have developers that are willing to fund some of it. At other times, dare I say, government might have a surplus and could provide some funding. At other times, local citizens say, you know, this flood insurance expense is getting pretty expensive. If I'm going to spend $1,200 a year on insurance, maybe I'd rather spend $400 a year on a special tax that pays for solving my problem. And then not only am I saving money, I'm actually reducing my risk, as opposed to just buying an insurance policy that I might have to use one day. So some of the different models we've seen, in California, assessments are very popular. They're property-based taxes, which are tied to the benefit received by the property. And under a constitutional provision in California, there's actually a nexus requirement that looks at the proportionality of the cost to the benefit received. So if I have a property that receives twice as much benefit as my neighbor, then in California, my assessment is going to be twice as big as my neighbor's. And how you determine benefit is a complicated formula. We actually steal what are called depth damage curves from the Army Corps of Engineers. And those curves look at how high water gets in a building in light of that depth, what the damages are likely to be. And we basically develop a metric across all structures of what the damage is likely to be from a flood. And then you say, well, if you could avoid that damage, that would be a benefit. So let's compare the different damages, and let's develop a formula to determine what the assessment is. And we've done 7 or 8 of these in the last 5 years in California, and the citizens support it. It's required a lot of education and a lot of messaging, and I'll talk about that a bit later, but the citizens have supported it. It varies in dollars, and obviously you need a population base to make it work, May not work in all areas of the coastal communities, but in metropolitan communities it works well. My assessment, because I happen to be in an area that's already reasonably protected and have not required a lot of new projects, my assessment right now is about $75 a year on my house. We have communities that have just done assessments where you might pay $500 a year on your house every year for 30 years. And that's a lot of money, but without that, they're going to be paying $1,200 a year for flood insurance. So basically, they're going to pay both costs for a period of time until the levees can get completed, and then they don't pay flood insurance anymore. There are some communities that do sales taxes. They look at it and say, you can analyze it from a protecting my property perspective, but this is really protecting a community, and they do sales taxes. Not expecting that's going to happen in any quick time up here, but I will point out that's how it's done some places. And then developer fees are increasingly common, in particular in communities where without the improvements, the land could not be developed. And so just as a developer often has to pay fees to cover future sewer infrastructure or water supply infrastructure, they are increasingly willing in some areas of the country to pay money towards flood protection because it's a basic required infrastructure to proceed. And those models vary. Some of them pay flat upfront fees. Oh, in order to get my whatever approved, my 500 houses approved, I have to pay you $1 million up front. And some of them actually do fees associated with the homes over time. So they might create a revenue stream where every home pays $100 a year for the next 20 years, and then that's a revenue stream that can be bonded against to raise local dollars. And then finally, state grant funding, which I see as a potential from Senator Johnson's bill. And it really is an opportunity for the state to say, just as we, the state, fund transportation or fund rail or fund whatever else is that the state provides grants for, we think flood protection is also of value. And those grants can be feasibility study grants, where the state might give $2 million to do a study. And it might be construction grants, where the state gives hundreds of millions of dollars for construction. In California, those are funded as a result of state-passed bonds. We were talking about this at lunch today. California seems to visit bonding approvals to its population every year or two, and about every 5 to 7 years, it's a flood protection subject. So in California, you have to get a vote of the electorate to pass any bond for the state to sell. And pretty much in California, if you put safety, flood protection, parks, and recreation in the name of the bond, it has a really good chance of passage. Today we have a bond measure on the ballot in California, which I voted on before I left this morning. And it will give about $500 million to flood protection, about $100 million of that in the Central Valley. We had a $5 billion bond pass in 2008. We had about $500 million flood protection bond pass in 2001. And so the electorate just kind of gets used to this normal pattern, and the state is very judicious, and it uses the money to try to motivate local cost shares. So the state will say, we'll give you 50% of your project money, but if you add a recreation element, we'll give you 60%. And if you add some habitat, we'll give you 70%. And if you're a disadvantaged community, we'll bump it to 80%. And this has been a good way for the state of California to motivate the behavior it's looking for to meet its overall state goals and to convince local communities to proceed and to advance projects. So I have a slide on here, USACE's backup, and Kevin, I hope you don't take offense to the backup role. It's not intended that way, but it is recognizing that often local communities can get a project done faster than the Corps. And that's not so much a function of the Corps' ability to construct as it's a function of the speed at which Congress doesn't authorize projects and doesn't appropriate money. Federal projects are authorized under an act called WRDA. Traditionally, it's the Water Resources Development Act, but last year was the Water Resources Reform and Development Act. So instead of WRDA, it's WRDA. And WRDA is the way that projects can be authorized for the Corps to construct. The model is supposed to be every 2 years. WRDA was passed in 2014. It was passed in 2007. It was passed in the year 2000. It was passed in '96. So you see it's not really every 2 years. And the time involved in waiting for Congress to pass the act often makes the Corps a slower process. Once it's actually authorized, then you have to get money appropriated. And as a new mechanism to control spending, Congress has implemented something called a New START approval, where Congress says, okay, it's authorized, now you have to get another approval from us called a New START, and then you can get appropriations. And traditionally, if you're really popular and you have all the leaders on your side, you might get a New START the next year. Usually it takes at least 2 years. Some projects it takes 5 years. And then you're dealing with appropriations. And you can imagine with a $250 million-ish construction budget around the country, that if you were even to just divide that up on population, maybe Oregon would be looking at $5, $10, $15 million a year, $20, $25 million a year. It takes a long time to get a project started. When you spend $5 million a year on a project, what you're doing is you're funding a very large construction management and engineering team and a very small construction project. And you end up with a very inefficient project over time. So the backup is not saying that the Corps can't construct projects. It's saying that if the Corps can't get the project authorized by Congress and can't get the money, it's going to be 5, 10, maybe 15 years down the line. Well, if it's down the line, what do we do in the interim? And that's the concept of backup. So some of the levies in Oregon are project levies, meaning they're authorized levies, meaning Congress has already said these exist and they're federalized and we are connected to them. And then other levies are just existing levies that some farmer constructed or a local district constructed. And whether it's an already authorized levy or a non-authorized levy, you can try to get a feasibility study, which is where Congress says, yes, Corps, go ahead and study it. We want to understand the feasibility of a project at this particular location. Those feasibility studies are a tough competition. There is actually I guess the equivalent of a federal RFP on the street right now as a result of WRDA saying if you think you want to study, you should let us know, and the deadline's early December. And that's where you can try to get in the queue to get a feasibility study. It appears that another WRDA is required to get feasibility studies started if you don't have one already, although there is some mechanism to actually get what are known as GRRs, which are reevaluation reports on existing projects if you have a funding stream, and it's probably more complicated than we do need to talk about it as the room as a whole, but if anyone has questions, we can talk about that afterwards. But these are studies that should last 3 years at longest because the Corps has really gotten its act together and making these studies much more compact. And they should be $3 million at most, which are cost shared 50% federal, 50% non-federal. So you contribute $1.5 million to get a $3 million study going. And when you have these studies going, you can apply for what's known as credit. So by example, if you had an authorized federal project, then you would have a 35% cost share for that project to be constructed. So if you have a $100 million project, you're going to pay $35 million. Well, if you want to go and construct $35 million worth of work in advance, under certain conditions, you can construct it, and you can get a $35 million credit, or IOU, which is you saying, hey, I've already done my part, now Army Corps, we'd like you to do your part. There are many restrictions on how this works, but it does exist, and this is one mechanism for getting ahead and having the Corps come in and finish the project. That credit application will still require that your project ultimately get authorized. It'll still require that someone analyzes the work you did and confirms that that work is consistent with what the study says. It'll require that money is appropriated, and then the Army Corps of Engineers can do the actual construction. So that's the role of USACE in backup. Now, if you do decide to take on a project yourself, in addition to the funding issue, there are a number of other issues that you have to face. You have permitting issues. If you have a project levy, meaning that levy is authorized already, then you have to go through 408, which is 33 U.S.C. 408. It's a federal code section that basically says you can't touch a federal levy, dike, harbor, etc., without permission from the Army Corps of Engineers. And it's a fairly extensive permitting process, and a few people in the room have gone through it and know that. You obviously have to comply with the Endangered Species Act and with NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, if there's any federal connection to the project. You have very delicate issues of messaging. How do you convince your locals that they should support this project? How do you convince the Army Corps of Engineers that you doing the advanced construction isn't trying to prevent them from doing their work eventually, but is part of a partnership? So it requires some very thought out messaging of how you can both convince your locals that there's a reason for you to be out there in front doing the work, but not in the process alienate the federal agency that you're counting on to help you finish the project. And then there's the interplay with other federal projects, which is while you're doing the construction, what happens if the study says, no, that alternative you're about to construct, that's not one the federal government supports? And how flexible can you be in building something which aligns with that eventual federal project? So I wanted to give you an example, a few examples of some projects. SAFCA, the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, you see we have this very common acronym model in California. We have SAFCA, SJAFCA, SBUFCA, WSAFCA, and TRILIA, or as they're called, the AFCAs and ILIA, which to me is kind of like Homer's books. But the Natomas project is a project that SAFCA undertook, and it followed the exact model we talked about. It's about $1 billion project, and the locals have constructed about $450–500 million on that project, and then the project was authorized and are now looking to the Corps to finish that project. I should tell you that the kinds of problems we have had in the Central Valley, before I scare the bejesus out of you completely, are not necessarily the kind of problems you're going to have up here. The Central Valley is really plagued by something called underseepage, which is where the levees are built on a sandy foundation, and when the rivers fill up, the water just shoots right underneath the levee and pops out the other side. And unlike some of the issues you have up here, which are erosion and potentially some levee height issues and some access issues, underseepage tends to be very expensive. There's really only two ways to address it. One is you do seepage berms, where you buy 100 to 300 feet of land behind the levee and pile dirt against the levee, which requires a lot of real estate and buying a lot of dirt. The other way is by doing what are known as slurry walls, where you dig trenches down the center of the levee, and you basically fill them up with a concrete mix. Those run $5 to $10 million a mile. It adds up really quickly. So don't take these numbers as identifying what the costs are going to be necessarily in Oregon. They'll still be scary costs from a local budget perspective, but they're not as big as what we're talking about. The North Area Local Project was a project that was done by SAFCA about 20 years ago. Again, the same model. The locals started doing it, and then the Army Corps came in and finished it and provided a little bit of reimbursement. SJAFCA, the San Joaquin Area Flood Control Agency, did a project in the 1990s. The FEMA came along and said, you know, we don't think your levees are high enough, and we think you have some erosion issues. And SJAFCA went to the Corps and said, can we get a study started? And the Corps said, yes. It'll probably take this many years, and then you'll be in line for this, and then you'll be in line for that. And SJAFCA said, okay, we're going to get started ourselves. And 3.5 years later, they had spent $90 million and had protected a community of 250,000 people. They then got federal legislation for reimbursement and actually got money after the fact from the Army Corps of Engineers. It's really hard to get reimbursement nowadays, so don't count on it as a funding source, but it's another example. For SAFCA, I'm special counsel. For SJAFCA, I'm general counsel. For TRILIA, I'm general counsel as well. The Plumas Lake and Olivehurst project is about $450 million project. That's one where there is no federal connection to it. It was all done locally. Now, it was done locally through a very creative mix of financing. The initial $150 million was funded by developers during the mid-2000s. The project was conceived when suddenly FEMA said, there's no protection here. There isn't a 100-year protection. And at the same time, there were developers who had just finished building all of the infrastructure for 12,000 homes. They had put in sewer, water, streets, all the lots. They were building the 5th or 6th house, and were told, nope, you don't have flood protection. And so those developers came up with about $130, $140 million, somewhere in that range, to get things started. The state said, if you build a setback levee, which will promote ecosystem values that we like, we'll contribute to your project, and the state provided about $130, $140 million. There were some other local funds raised, and then finally the local water agency had some revenue from a dam that they received because they were selling power to PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, and they put about $30 million in. And so it was a combination of funding from all sources to get this project built. There was no federal involvement in that one. WSAFCA, West Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, their very first project, they took it big. It was 600 feet long, called the I Street Project, putting in a slurry wall. That was about $800,000, and that was all local dollars. And then the Rivers and CHP and Southport are another $150 million worth of projects. That's about 15 miles of slurry wall, and that was funded locally and through state dollars. I'm not as familiar with the next three, but I wanted to give them to you as examples. I participate in something called the National Coalition of Flood Project Partners. It's a coalition myself and 2 other people started about 3 years ago, and it consists of non-federal sponsors, people who partner with the Corps on projects. We get on the phone once a month and talk about issues. And so through that group, I've met people around the country, and we've done some fly-ins. We've gone to DC together to lobby for issues. So the city of Dallas has a project that they've funded themselves, and it's in the neighborhood of $50 to $100 million, and it's providing increased protection for its riverfront area. And significant funding came from the business community, because this was the next area to be built. This was all the new warehouses were going to go, where all the infrastructure was going to go, where all the industrial was going to go. After years of general plans, this was where it was going to be, and suddenly they couldn't do it because of the flood issue. And so the business community came forward and formed assessment districts for themselves to raise the money to do the work. East St. Louis is the example I gave before. They took an old entity and repurposed it, and they have been constructing. They're at about $80 million of levee improvements. That's something like 30 or 40 miles. They don't have the deep underseepage issues. They have a lot of freeboard issues, meaning levee height, and they've raised that money through taxes and grants from the state. And then Louisiana, obviously most people know that the Army Corps put billions, I think it's like $10 billion into the Louisiana flood protection system, but that is only the first bit of what's needed. And the state of Louisiana is funding a lot from oil and gas revenues that it receives, trying to do increased flood protection down there.